Welcome everyone to today's webcast, Managing the Ransomware Response, Ensuring Resilience Through Recovery. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia. Let's cover a couple of housekeeping items before we actually get started into today's material. Today's webcast is being recorded and you will be sent a copy of that recording via email in another day or so, post the webcast. If you do have any questions, by all means, put those into the Q&A box. We're not only going to try and have Q&A time at the end of today's webcast, but certainly we'll try to incorporate any questions, comments, anecdotes, anything you feel like sharing throughout today's webcast during the webcast itself. So we've got that up here in front of us. So please participate as much as you'd like to and get in on the conversation. And then lastly, today's format is a little different than what you're used to. Rather than this being countless numbers of slides, this is really more of a very small slide deck that's focused on a conversation with my two other guests today. The first up is going to be Travis Evans. He's Senior Sales Engineer with OffsiteDataSync. Travis, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, hey Nick, it's a pleasure. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here as well. And John Cousins, he's a cloud architect from Zerto. John, thanks for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Yep. And as I mentioned, this is a discussion formatted webcast, which means there's not a lot of slides. I think we've got a total of 4 or 5. So if you don't see the slides advancing very much, that's okay. That's normal. We'd rather you focus in on the conversation, and as I mentioned previously, participate in on the conversation with your questions and your comments in the Q&A box, which we've got up and running here. So the place we're going to start here today is just quickly go over today's agenda, and the agenda in today's webcast is to first off look at what the reality of ransomware attacks look like in today's day and age, what it takes to turn ransomware response into actual resilience for your operations, and how to achieve that resilience from ransomware, and then recovering hopefully in minutes, not hours, days, weeks, and so on. So let's start with, first off, the reality of ransomware attacks today. I want to start with a couple of industry stats, not to create FUD, that's not the goal here, but it's to use statistically relevant sample data that helps kind of indicate what's going on in the trends in the industry so that you can get a sense of how much you need to pay attention to this, how big of an issue is it really, what are the nuances that should have you concerned, and so on. So the first stat I've got here is 51% of organizations have been hit with some form of ransomware one way or the other in the last 12 months. That comes from Sophos, as you see at the bottom left, State of Ransomware Report this year. So half of you have had ransomware attacks, if not all of you, because you're on today's webcast. You're at least either concerned about it or have already experienced it, but on the average here, about half. Secondarily, a little over half, 59% of attacks also end up including cloud data. Today's ransomware authors are not just utilizing a single payload that is an encryption, kind of malware that encrypts data on a given endpoint. No, this is far more complex. They are utilizing bots, they're using all kinds of scripting code, they're moving laterally, manually within organizations, doing anything and everything possible to access as much different parts of an organization's data as is possible. And that includes trying to gain access to cloud data in an effort to try and guarantee that they'll receive their ransom, make sure that it's paid. That also comes from the Sophos State of Ransomware Report. The last one here is the average number of days of downtime. It's 15, and that's just the average. Depends, of course, on the scope of the attack, whether or not it's like there's an attack that came out just the other day. It was Telecom Argentina, and they had literally 18,000 endpoints were impacted by ransomware. 18,000, that's not going to be 15 days of downtime. And so that's just the average. It can be a lot worse. That comes from CovaWare's Q1 ransomware marketplace report, as you can see in the lower left of your screen here. And then two other sort of observations that I've seen over the last about 12 months. One is actually still a stat, come to think of it, that's paying the ransom, according to Sophos, actually doubles the remediation costs. So not only if you pay the ransom, that's great, but you're also still going to have so much money being spent in remediation costs, it may not actually be worth paying the ransom. So the focus here should really be on trying to create that resilience as opposed to let me try and pay the ransom and that'll help speed things up. And it also just should be noted that phishing and RDP attacks are still the top attack vectors that are utilized to infect systems with ransomware. So kind of just keep that in mind. Now, to kind of start the conversation off, Travis, if I could pull you into this for a second, and maybe we can start talking about the scope of ransomware attacks today. What are you seeing with your customers and prospects in regards to who's being hit? Is this across all verticals, organization sizes? What are you seeing?
Yeah, it really is everyone from the smallest to the largest organizations and across all verticals, whether that's city governments, municipalities, manufacturing is a big one, even the financial industry, healthcare. I've seen all of them in some way be impacted by ransomware.
Excellent, excellent. John, are you seeing the same thing on your customers?
Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. I mean, I'm coming from the city of Atlanta, so we had a famous hit last year, was it, or the year before?
Yep.
And I think it was a $50,000 ransom, and the city's expected to pay it was like $7 million, or I think to correct everything. The biggest problem is that they just were relying on traditional backup technologies, right, and thinking that was good enough, but really lacking any kind of real testing to see if they could recover from any of that. And I think when we got hit, they realized they couldn't, so there was a lot of data that was just lost. There was a lot of systems that just had to start from scratch.
What's interesting, you're talking about almost like an assumption that they're going to be fine, and they've relied on backups. Maybe we can shift over to the impact of an attack as sort of a quick topic here, John. What are your customers seeing with regard to this issue of like data loss, downtime? I mean, is it 15 days? Is it more than that? Is it less than that? What about the data that's impacted? What are you seeing?
15 days, I would say, is pretty typical. Some of our company's big partners I've seen days like that, but when they were trying to recover with their traditional backup tools, and the problem with traditional backup is even if you're heavily testing it, you might be able to do your backups in a quick window, but restoring backups are typically the hard part, right? So getting them off of tape or traditional, purpose-built backup appliances, all of those are slow points in the process of getting your data back. So that's part of what causes that problem of having such a long downtime, as well as maybe not protecting everything that you maybe thought you should have been protecting. So maybe you restored some critical databases, application servers, web servers, but then realized there were some critical components to the application that you just weren't protecting.
No, I tend to agree. In fact, what we maybe do this is you've almost given me my segue to my next slide, which is really thinking about the response to ransomware. But the response, I think, to kind of the points that you've been making is a lot more about sort of planning ahead of time for a ransomware attack rather than actually just responding to it. Would you agree?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, so for those of you in the audience here, in order to avoid some of the common pitfalls when you're thinking about responding to ransomware, you heard John mention that backup may take a short period of time, but recovery takes perhaps a lot longer. Recovery needs to be a big part of the strategy here. You really need to be thinking about what does recovery look like and work backwards to backup. It's literally doing this backwards, and that's on purpose. It's got to be a major part of your strategy in order to figure out what will I need to recover if we get hit with a ransomware attack. It's a big if, because you don't know the scope. You don't know which parts of your organization are going to be hit. You don't know how many systems. You don't know any of those things. So you have to make probably some worst case scenario guesses and make sure you're protecting everything that is deemed absolutely critical. Now, one of the biggest pitfalls is the fact that ransomware isn't seen as one of these disaster scenarios. When you think about your disaster recovery planning, lots of organizations go through the traditional things: fire, acts of nature, power loss, all those kinds of things, right? But then not so much thinking about ransomware attacks as an actual disruption to business, even though you heard me say it, you probably went, yeah, that makes sense. It is a disruption to business. It is. And so you've got to see it as an actual disaster scenario and then start to plan for it. Now, some of the repercussions that exist because ransomware is not seen as a disaster scenario, then there's no backup scope defined specifically to make sure the environment can be recovered in the event of a ransomware attack. There is no recovery objectives determined. So no one's trying to figure out what our RTOs and RPOs look like. Now, in concept, in all fairness, you may have the same RPOs and RTOs for given workloads and critical tiers systems. regardless of what disaster scenario strikes. And so that may not be necessary, but you got to figure out, well, if everything is encrypted, how much time do we have to get those things back up and running? There might be some play here to try and figure out if there's any different recovery objectives. You certainly may not have a recovery plan that's ransomware specific. And then, as you even heard both, I think Travis and John mentioned just in briefly in passing, is perhaps no testing of this kind of scenario. So Travis, what's the greatest mistake you see customers making when it comes to, let's say, preparing recovery for a ransomware attack?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thing kind of comes to mind is, at least thankfully most companies, I think, have become aware of the dangers that are out there. So they at least already have some level of data protection these days. I think there was a time probably a couple of years ago where it was scary, the number of companies and organizations that didn't even have some sort of data protection backups or replication or something like that to recover from. So I think the biggest thing that we find ourselves in now is that organizations tend to just check that box, the box that says you have backups or you have data protection, or you could, recover a deleted file or something fairly simplistic. Maybe it's because of compliance, maybe it's just for their own board or auditing that they kind of have that mentality. And I think you do see some compliances becoming more aggressive with not just that you have the data protection, but that you are testing it, and that you do have a plan, and they want to see that plan, and that plan itself was walked through and either simulated partially or fully. So I think that's still the biggest thing to go kind of along with those bullet points there. For sure, those are really some of the key mistakes and things you still see. But really, in my opinion, the biggest one is that customers and organizations aren't testing. They're not validating what data protection they have in place, because really that's the biggest thing. That data protection is only as good as you test it, and that it's only as good as that you can recover from it, you can be up and running again in X amount of time, or that you can get back to kind of a state of normal before an event were to occur or something like that.
Great stuff. John, same kind of question here. Greatest mistake you see organizations making when they're preparing for recovering from ransomware?
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with Travis that testing is the biggest one. You can back up everything, right? But a DR plan is only as strong as your weakest missing VM or corrupted tape out there, right? So, like if you've, and I'm pretty old. I'll be 47 this year. I've been in IT for 20-something years now, so I've done the old school DR tests of trying to recover from tapes, and basically there's 20 people sitting in a room waiting for one guy to recover a whole tape library for him to say, oh, tape 22 is corrupted. And basically the whole DR test failed after you sat there for 3 hours, right? So if you've never tested, and when you do test, it's that expensive that you have to bring in all of your heavy hitters of your company to just sit around and then wait for somebody to do something like that, it's not very successful, right? So that's the testing is the biggest one, but also no backup scope being defined as well. I would say that's a big one in the list. You might be backing up a bunch of random servers that you consider critical, right? But they're backed up random hours. The database is 2 in the morning, the web server is at 4, the app server is at 3. They're all scattered of when you can just squeeze them in a backup window. But you're not necessarily backing up 100% of every one of your virtual machines, because you probably can, even in a backup window from 2 to 7 in the morning. There's probably only a certain amount of VMs you can back up, right? So that's the biggest thing, not having a scope defined of thinking, hey, if we were to get hit and every single one of our virtual machines were hit in this scenario, what would that look like? Not just recovering, the critical management servers. What would it look like if everything was down?
You bring up an interesting point, John. You mentioned the sort of the backup windows and fitting something in whenever it's, there's a window between 1:45 and 2:30 in the morning, or something along those lines, right? And what's fascinating about that is, so for those of you in the audience, if you're in that kind of a mode, that is one of the pitfalls. You're in it right now, because this is one of those things where you absolutely must start with the business scenario, the business disruption scenario in a ransomware attack, and then work backwards and figure out all the way back to the tech, and to figure out whether or not what you have in place is correct. We're talking more about this on the next slide, but that scoping is absolutely critical. It's not just, well, that's all we can do. That's all we have. We only have 1:45 to 2:30 in the morning. That's probably not a good enough answer. The answer is probably then you have to change the backup technology you're using. you're using the wrong way. Like if you're still using tape, I'm going to use a ludicrous example. I'm hoping no one's using tape these days. But if you're still using tape, right, and you're going, well, the tape is only so fast, well, then you need to get rid of tape. I mean, I know it's easier for me to say than for you to do, and I totally get that. But that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is to go, we're not going to be able to recover from a ransomware strategy, a ransomware attack, if we stay on the current platform. And that's the message you've got to give to your C-suite, and you have to change that because the backup scope is going to have to change in order to be able to recover. So great point, John. Travis, do you think organizations, aren't preparing for this? And if so, why?
Yeah, I don't think that they really are, and I think probably the kind of maybe the two biggest reasons are really that I think budget is part of it. The dollars and cents. I think budget ends up becoming a hindrance because in order to not just focus on the day-to-day part of business, which probably gets the bulk of the attention of a budget, but really protecting and ensuring that your business can be resilient, that it can be running, as soon as possible after some sort of a disaster event like ransomware attack. I think more often than not, the budget is a hurdle as opposed to something that then maybe sets the boundaries that allow for a better workflow and ultimately protect an organization and protect a company, because the budget is protecting the bank account, but it should also be used to protect the business itself and the work that the company is doing. I think the other part of that, not just more of the financial part is a hindrance to the preparations, but just the nature of ransomware. I think ransomware is one of the ultimate disasters you don't see coming. It's not like a natural disaster that you maybe can see forecasting and get prediction, or there's a season for it. It's not like maybe something more like fire, where you have other safeguards in place through codes and municipalities and things, and protection built in just by nature of having a building, that sort of thing. So I think just by the nature of how ransomware affects a business is also a part of it, which kind of leads into, you talked about, RDP and, kind of the human error element of it, of like through phishing attacks. Mm-hmm. That's also part of it, where ransomware, it really does still at a high level take advantage of human error. That can be expensive to do training, and consistent properly training. We also talked about testing. Doing testing can be expensive depending on what it is, whether or not it's just time, even that's a cost. It doesn't have to be overly expensive depending on the solution and what's taking place, but it's the sort of thing where, people may not want to take a system down for a while or do maybe even like a partial simulated test. But really, I think it's also that human element where that's kind of the big part that is hard to prepare against, and I still think I see organizations struggling with. I read an article just the other day where 78% of participants stated in a questionnaire that they confirmed that they're aware that is a risk, that clicking on like unknown links, phishing attacks, they're aware of that vernacular, they're aware that threat exists. But the first group that was tested, 20% of the people said they clicked the link in the email, but the reality was actually closer to 50% actually clicked the link. So really it was kind of twice as many as you expect. So really the threat is bigger than you probably expect. And they did that with a second group, kind of the same idea. 16 or so percent said that they admitted that they clicked, when really the number was twice that, closer to 25-30%. So I think that's the reality of it as well, is you still got that human element. You talked about RDP. You can close ports, you can validate against port closures, and a port itself won't reopen just because it felt like it. Whereas the human error element of it is something where that's just consistent training. You have maybe employee turnover, so you've got to constantly be retraining and training new employees, and that goes back to the budget side of it. So I think that's all of that is part of the hard part of playing defense, that there really is a part of this.
Interesting. I totally agree. The human factor comes into play here, as well as some of the technical aspects, like closing the RDP ports and that sort of thing. And the training certainly does make a lot of sense for organizations to make sure that that human factor, so the user becomes part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that's the deciding factor there. But once an attack gets in, obviously those of you in the audience are going to have to figure out how do I get myself back to a known secure state. John, you mentioned sort of some people may have randomly picking, it's critical workloads. I know you don't mean like randomly, but in essence, I got your point, which is they weren't specific to a ransomware attack. Maybe we talk real quick about what workloads should our audience be including in their ransomware recovery planning.
Yeah, I would say everything nowadays, right? Anything virtual. Yeah, somebody made a point to me. It was like if a VM wasn't critical or you didn't need it, why would you deploy it, right? Why would I waste a Windows VM or a SQL VM just for a server to sit out there that's one extra VM for my team to have to patch and maintain for no reason, right? You put it out there for a reason. It might be a minor reason. It might be a little license server. It might be a file server that does something for one of your applications. But you know, if you're not backing up everything, all of your virtual workloads, nobody's going to know what all those little servers are, right? You leave your job and a new admin comes in, and the application consists of these 20 different VMs, and one of them seems like not so important. It's not being backed up. It just seems like it's not really doing much. You're like, hey, why should I protect that, right? Well, like I said, your DR plan's only as strong as that missing VM. So you could do your whole recovery plan, bring up your entire application, and you're missing that one little VM that maybe just had a license key on it or something minor, right? A host file or just something that part of your app needed. So like nowadays, I don't think there's any such thing as these like non-critical VMs, right? I think we all know that, you know, CPU, RAM, compute resources are expensive. VMware licenses are expensive. You're not going to deploy things that aren't critical. And you know, one of the things Travis mentioned about companies not preparing, I think it's, even if companies are seeing ransomware as a disaster scenario, they're just looking at it as a typical disaster scenario, you know, like a hurricane or you know, hey, if something happens, I can just come and recover these files I had, these servers I have from backup, right? But ransomware is going to hit you everywhere, right? It's going to spread, it's going to hit file servers, it's going to hit a lot of components that you maybe weren't backing up or backing up as frequently as you thought you needed, right? So I gotta say nowadays, kind of everything is critical, especially if you're virtualizing. It's a good chance that it's something critical to some application you have, and whether you know it or not, as an admin, it's critical to somebody in your infrastructure.
And I think it's interesting is the good news there, because your answer first off, everything, you know, that's more or less what you said. You must back up everything. And for some of you folks in the audience, you might be literally going, I don't have the backup windows for that. There's no way I can do that. And so the good news is there are technologies that exist today that can facilitate the ability for you to literally back up and protect everything. It does exist.
Yeah, and to make a great point to that, I used to be that backup admin, and I totally agree. You only have a window, right? Your boss tells you between midnight and 7 a.m. is where you have to get everything backed up, and you do your best with whatever console you have to squeeze it all in there, but you're never going to get everything. You just can't. There's no possible way to do it, right? Your infrastructure can't get everything. So you just have to pick the most critical of the apps and servers. But in a lot of that time, that's you as the backup admin are making that decision, which maybe isn't even like you're not the application owner. You're not the guy on the ops team that knows, hey, I need these 4 other servers to go with that database server you're backing up, right? So you're just doing your best job as a backup admin. Hey, I'm guessing this SQL server is the most critical, and who cares about those 3 other Windows servers, right? So that's part of the problem. Things are critical, but you as a backup admin, you have no choice. You have to make kind of critical cuts to the team of who makes the backup window, right?
Makes perfect sense. It's like backup windows are so yesterday, and yet we're still trying to get around them. So let's do this. Let's talk a little bit. If those in the audience, you've figured out, you understand the problem, you understand some of the pitfalls that you may be falling into. Let's talk about how to kind of fix this and what things should you be doing turn a ransomware response into something that is far more looks like resilience for the business. So it's not just about recovering, it's about actually making the business resilient. And so I've got a couple of best practices I'm going to put up here, and then we're talk a little bit about them. The first one I think we've kind of hit home already, which is you've got to assume that this is when and not if. That's important. If it hasn't happened to you, if you're one of those 49% of people that have not had your organization hit with ransomware, you're very fortunate. It's getting worse. These folks are getting nastier and nastier by the quarter. I pay attention to this quite a bit. Look at all kinds of different families of ransomware, the tactics that they're using. Case in point, that Telecom Argentina attack that I just mentioned with the 18,000 endpoints earlier today included someone gaining access to domain admin rights, which means they actually did a whole lateral movement. They actually elevated their own permissions. They lurked around until they could finally get themselves the right account they needed access to, and that's actually how they went and infected all 18,000 endpoints. they're getting really nasty. So you have to assume this is a when, not an if, because if you don't, it's not going to look good on the other end of this. The other thing here is look at your recovery point objectives and your recovery time objectives for each of these workloads. You should actually be defining them. To John's point, if you are in that situation where you're like, I have a 7-hour window and I'm trying to cram everything in, and you are having to decide, you're like the triage nurse of backups. You're deciding, who gets backed up and who doesn't, who lives and who dies, so to speak. Then if you're in that boat, then you should probably stop and level set and go, no. Let's look at workload A. What does workload A need? What are the right RTO? What's right RTO and RPO for workload A? Regardless of what you have in place today and regardless of what you can accomplish today. And so, and then do that for workload B, C, D, E, and F, because the idea there is then you start defining what the business needs are, and then you could go back and say, we don't have the right tech in place. Because that's the real way to go back to your C-suite, to your board, and so on, is to actually have a business conversation with them, not a technical conversation, a business conversation. Say, look, this is how quickly we need to recover, and we need to recover in, I'm going to make up something very simple, we need to recover in 15 minutes. But with our backup solutions we have in place today, it's going to take us at least 2 hours. Again, those aren't the right numbers, but you get my point. If you go to them and saying, we don't have what we need, the likelihood of us getting hit with a ransomware attack is this high, here's some industry stats, blah, blah, blah. We need to change out our backup solution and the way that we do backups, because there's no way we're going to be able to recover from this if it happens. So kind of keep that in mind. Then there's that issue to recover everything to, again, what I call a known secure state. Use my Telecom Argentina example. Their systems were so compromised, someone got domain admin rights. Typically when there's an attacker getting domain admin rights, they've established persistence throughout the entire network. That means that they've gone into workstations, into different servers, inside Active Directory. They've created multiple accounts to make sure that if you find the one account they have access to, they've got 17 more or 25 more or whatever it is that you don't know yet about, and that way they can get back in. And I mean, so that network is compromised. That the whole network has to be recovered. So even if, let's say we're talking about ransomware, but it's in one of these scenarios where you find out someone got access to our domain admin account, you have to assume that every system is compromised. And if you want to protect it, you must recover it back to a known secure state. What point in time is that? I have no idea. But you're going to have to do that for every system, every server, every application, everything. That's a huge undertaking and a nightmare scenario, but it may actually be true. And then the other part here is just to consider the value of a managed partner. And the reason for this is you probably have your backups pretty much down pat. You know how to, make a backup and recover it. It's not hard, right? But the idea is when you're in a scenario like this, where you're now trying to either plan for this properly, trying to get validation that you need better technology, better backup technology in order to facilitate the recovery that's necessary, and or during the recovery scenario itself, need assistance, prioritizing, executing, all of that. Someone that actually focuses on helping do disaster recovery, a partner that does that, has the expertise, has the experience, has seen these before, all that kind of stuff is really going to help minimize the amount of time it takes to actually accomplish the recovery. John, I'm going to start with you. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. It is not just 4 things you have to do and then bing, you're awesome. You're perfect for ransomware. You know what to do now. So what would you add? What would you add to the list?
Yeah, I mean, I like your last bullet point of consider hiring a partner, right, to help you out. So hire a partner that can help you do a ransomware assessment of your environment, right? Come in, not just a ransomware assessment, maybe come in and do like a vSphere assessment. Assess your whole environment, see the state of where your things are, how your backup tools work, what you're backing up. Do you actually have a framework in place for ransomware? Is it enforced? Are you enforcing that your employees don't log in with domain admin accounts? They log in with a regular account and have a separate domain admin account for doing their work-related tasks, right? And are you continuously testing, continuously testing? This is something that's pretty critical. We probably never do that. No matter what our backup tools are, replication tools, we're probably testing not as often as we should be. Because ransomware now, you made a good point that a lot of times they'll sit in your network, right? Somebody will drop something in there and wait. So you you're backing things up once a night, but you're just backing up a time bomb, basically, right? So you might have a week's worth of backups, and you roll back to last night, and that's still not good, and the night before, and it's still all has the ransomware encrypted in there, right? So have you gone through and tested to make sure that those backups themselves are valid? Is a critical factor, but also having an isolated environment. So the key is to isolate, right? So if you get hit with ransomware and you need to bring things back online, you don't want to just bring back on a file server into the same environment that has, you know, the domain controller that people have accounts on, and you know, there's viruses that are running around your file shares and your networks, right? You want to be able to bring on that production environment into an isolated environment that the ransomware environment can't see. So this is pretty critical, is to be able to have that environment to bring things up that mimic production without affecting anything in production, but bring up an identical copy, and then do whatever tests you need to ensure that your apps, your VMs, your files are all ready to go, right? And then I mentioned backing up everything as well earlier. Or, you know, imagine if you didn't have to worry about a backup window, right? What if you could just say, hey, I want to back up, you know, everything that I have in this entire application, all 100 of these VMs. But I just don't want to have to worry about it. I just want to push an easy button, and any point in time that I want to roll back, like a DVR, I can just say, hey, I want to roll back 5 seconds ago, or I want to roll back a month ago. That's kind of the point that you'd want to get to, right? Is not having to worry about those backup windows. So I agree. If you're struggling to squeeze in, especially if you have more than, you know, 200, 300 VMs in your environment, squeezing in VMs in that backup window is never going to happen. You're going to go to your boss and just like, we got to do something different. I can't fit it in here, or I'm going to have to back up VMs during the daytime, right? So starting to think through if you have the right technologies to even achieve those RPOs and RTOs that you're trying to get to.
Cool. I've been nodding violently in agreement with you as you were talking. I'm going, yep, yeah, yeah. Maybe my neck hurts. Travis, same question. What would you add to the list?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of almost like a broken record of planning and testing, but really it's ultimately about it's about prioritizing organization, you know, resilience, and having the ability to be up and running, to stay up and running through the event of a disaster. I think of like when I was a kid in elementary school, you know, sometimes we'd have these fire or tornado drills, and you know, what was the point of that? You know, and so obviously it's about the safety of the students. It's disruptive to the school day, but it's a necessary thing to do, not just, you know, because maybe the state requires it or something like that, but really it's so that when a disaster happens, you're prepared. You've not just talked about it or thought about it or written a document about it, but you've actually tested, and people, it's not for the first time they wonder, oh, where were we supposed to go, or what were we supposed to do? So walking through those tests, make it a practice and make it something to where it's more comfortable. Again, there's so many things to do, so many things to consider in part of disaster recovery and in dealing with these sort of threats. So I think performing a drill, and even a partial, you know, simulated test from time to time is better than nothing. And the ability to maybe even do more of a full scale test or walkthrough of a plan is invaluable. You know, and I think that the more comfortable we can be with these sort of things, really the more even go to kind of also go back to budget concerns, is it can actually save money and time in the long run. So I think of, you know, John's example of the city of Atlanta with, you know, the cost, so to speak, was $50,000 of the ransom, but the actual cost was, you know, $7+ million. So you look at, well, the budget doesn't allow for it, the budget doesn't allow for it, that sort of argument. Well, what will the budget allow for when the organization goes out of business, or when the cost is now so high to recover? That sort of consideration is where I think that really prioritizing data resilience, organizational resilience, is really something that kind of aligns with what I would add to these best practices, is kind of reshaping our framework of what are we prioritizing, what are we putting time, attention, money, all those things to. I think of like with you know, to kind of shame on me a little bit here, you know, when my fire alarms, you know, my smoke detectors, when they beep, you know, I take the battery out because it's annoying. And then maybe the next morning, you know, it's almost always 2 a.m. wakes you up. And then so I'll take the battery out so I can go back to sleep and find a battery the next day. And maybe I don't even have any 9-volt batteries. It's when I don't keep too many on hand, so I got to go get them. And then without fail, every time I replace it, I notice on the the smoke detector, it says test once a month, test once a month. I don't think I've ever tested a smoke detector once a month because I don't prioritize it. I think I don't have time for it. I have other things. And if I just put a counter reminder, I absolutely could do it. It's not, impossible. It's not impractical. So it's that sort of thing where it's about a frame of mind, a frame of reference. And too often we learn after the fact, unfortunately. And so it's kind of one of those where the more proactive you can be, the better.
And that analogy is great, Travis. It made me just think of something like, you would probably test more often, or it wouldn't be such a hassle if it just took, AA batteries instead of a 9-volt battery, right? So, the part of why you probably don't test as often is because your infrastructure doesn't allow it, or it's painful, or you have to completely, chop off parts of production and isolate 20 people on a team to go do that test, right? So it's so hard and painful to do that we don't. So your typical solutions are that 9-volt battery, right? That you just you don't have any on hand, right? So that's a great analogy.
I think it's a pain in the butt because they're way up on the ceiling and nobody wants to go up there at night,
that's
especially at 2 in the morning.
Yeah, I found myself standing on some unstable chairs, which would probably lead to a bigger problem.
Yeah, probably. So, John, let me ask you. We've all kind of insinuated a little bit, and I've mentioned at least twice on this webcast today, the idea that there are multiple ways that backups could be created, and therefore recovery could be initiated. But we haven't really talked about it, from a technology standpoint. And so, could I ask you to maybe cover a couple of ways that, various ways that backups it could be accomplished, and what's best going to suit the scenario of recovering from a ransomware attack?
Yeah, I'd say traditional backup technologies, which is almost everything. And the way we were doing every product you can buy, we're using traditional ways to do backups, right? Using the backup windows that we saw. And the reason that you're having to do those backup windows because those backup technologies either used agents inside your VMs, which affected performance, so you didn't want to do that during the day, or they used VMware snapshots, which also affect performance, right? So you don't want to do that during the day. So you're typically having to squeeze all your stuff into those tiny windows, right? You also have to have a separate infrastructure typically for backup infrastructure. So whether it be media servers that are handling whatever your backup tool is, and tape libraries possibly, and purpose-built backup appliances, and all kind of infrastructure that you have to maintain. That requires a whole team and guys that know that stuff, a guy that knows the data domain or the exagrid or whatever you've bought, right? So that's a whole different kind of team that has to maintain that infrastructure. It gets pretty complex, right? And then to recover a multi-VM application is super complex. It's everything's out of sync, right? You've backed up all of your VMs in different time windows. What you'd really love to do is say, hey, I have this application that's 10 VMs. I want to back up all of those at 2 in the morning, and they all finish exactly at the same time, right? That's not really realistic with any kind of traditional backup because they just, different VMs are different sizes, different busyness of I/O coming out of them, so they're never going to back up all at the same time. But that's what you want, right? You want your application to come online from a recovery as if it was 100% at the same point in time, right? Which is almost near impossible to do with typical technologies, right? And then you typically, the hardest point of any backup, right? Say you've found the perfect nirvana of backup windows. Say you had some artificial intelligence tool that just scheduled your VMs for you, if that existed, which maybe that's something we should invent, right? But maybe it just scheduled all your VMs in a perfect window. That's great, but what about restores, right? So restores are always going to be a pain point. Always, always, always. It doesn't matter, right? There's only so much data you can push over a 1 gig or even a 10 gig network on your in your infrastructure. Excuse me. So it's I can't flood, 1,000 golf balls through a garden hose all at the same time, right? There's only so much data I can restore back, and not only that, but if I'm restoring from tape libraries are extremely slow and have to categorize themselves. Or if it's an appliance that's doing, say, deduplication and compression, that I typically have to rehydrate my data, and which takes a long time, and then pull it over a slow network. So your restores are always going to be a pain point, right? So no matter how fast your backup windows have gotten where you've actually met those windows, restoring the data is always going to be painful. I think we've all realized that, and especially nowadays where your VMs are these big hyper, 5 terabyte VMs are like the norm now. That used to be humongous to me. Now people are like, oh, I have 6 or 7 of these 5 terabyte VMs. I'm like, wow, that's a lot. But try restoring those from tape over a network. There's only so much you can do, right? So now what technology is starting to morph, and what Zerto kind of coined the term continuous data protection, right? Is our CDP. Everybody's trying to jump on that bandwagon and trying to offer that service. Is something that we've been doing for about 15 years now, right? We're basically protecting virtual machines at all the time. So real-time replication, right? Near synchronous replication, but also taking checkpoints for your applications at 5 to 10 second increments whenever we can confirm that all of your application VMs are on the other side, right? So I'm replicating 10 VMs of an application. Zerto confirms that all 10 of them have gotten to the other side at an identical point in time. We'll take a checkpoint, and what that checkpoint is that's like your DVR or your Apple time machine, where you can roll back to 5 seconds ago, 10 seconds ago, 15 seconds ago, right? Anywhere from an hour up to 30 days, right? So this is called journaling, is what we're doing. The beauty of this, right, is that this is a solution that Offsite is using for their DRaaS offering. And what it'll allow you to do is, like I said, those just roll back in small, tiny increments, rather than worrying about having to restore from a slow backup, and even having to worry about backup windows, right? It's just always on, always taking those. You could think of it as like taking a backup every 5 seconds of your entire application stack, right? Without ever having to worry about any windows. There's no backup admin that has to come in the morning and worry about, VMware snapshots that didn't get deleted the night before from whatever tool you were using, or running out of space from the VMware snapshots, or the agents got corrupted, or having to maintain agents at a constant pace across thousands of VMs, right? So the beauty of continuous data protection is just always on, and it's built at the hypervisor level, so there's no changes that you have to make to anything in production. It's just something you turn on, you set up a group of VMs you want to replicate, and they replicate.
Good stuff. Very comprehensive answer. Love that. Travis, last question then I've got for you, and I know you guys have got a couple of slides you want to cover as well here. What role do you see a partner playing in facilitating, sort of the better, faster, more reliable, more responsive kind of method of remediating a ransomware attack, more than just an organization, let's say, do it themselves?
Yeah, really, I think the word that comes to mind is expertise, just because there's so many things to consider and take care of during a disaster. And so having a trusted partner allows you to better prioritize as a business all the other things, all the other, fires, so to speak, that you have to put out. So being able to leverage a trusted valued partner really is going to help it to where that's one less thing you have to worry about, or you don't have to worry about how long that might take or how that's going to work, because you've worked with that partner or they've just experienced it enough. So I think a partner that's also a DR expert really is invaluable, since they see disasters on a regular basis, whereas an individual company maybe has never experienced an outage or a disaster. So being able to work with a company that sees it consistently, it's not a surprise, it's not something that's terribly alarming. So it can bring a level of comfort and ease. I think about, I've never had knee surgery, but if I needed it and I go to a specialist and they say, yes, I've performed this procedure hundreds of times, I know exactly how to do it, what we're doing, what we're looking at here, nothing out of the normal. Maybe it's, scary for me, or there's some pain or discomfort. I can just have a level of comfort and ease, even though it's something I've never experienced. I don't know what it's like. I wouldn't know what to expect. But having a partner, having someone that it's not new to them, can be a part of where they can bring in, to kind of go back to the expertise, they can bring all that knowledge. Whereas maybe, it might be hard for me to try to recruit or employ people that have kind of similar levels of expertise, because probably as my business, that's not what I do. I'm probably not in the DR business. I'm probably not in maybe even the tech business. Maybe I am in manufacturing or something like that. And so I want to prioritize there. And then just as a business operations and a unit like that, when there is a disaster, there's so many operational business level insurance, so many things that are needing to take place that add into the time frame of kind of getting back to normal, normal in quotes there, to where the more I can leverage a partner and a trusted, valued partner, the better, because maybe that even offsets cost and offsets, resource, employee people expenses and things that are limiting to me today.
Yeah, just to add to what Travis said, like a DR is very hard, right? It's not backups. It's complicated, but DR is very hard, right? You're moving over to whole new data centers. IP addresses are changing. Network settings are changing. Load balancers. So many things that are very complex. So I agree. Having somebody that has that expertise of seeing the forest through the trees and not just the VMs that are failing over is pretty critical. And seeing they've been through the pain points. They know what customers typically forget. Typically you forgot these firewall rules, right? They're going to know all of those kind of things. So, failing over into a data center on your own could be a pretty tricky scenario, right? So having that expertise, I would say, is critical.
Good stuff, guys. Really appreciate that. A lot of good insight here. So let me do this. Let me go ahead and just kind of summarize everything that we've talked about today. I'm going to skip this one slide here and just kind of summarize everything that we've discussed. And then I know that John, you've got a couple of slides. Travis, you've got one. And then we'll see if there's any questions for us to do at the end of the webcast today. Those of you in the audience, of course, if you have questions, stick them in the Q&A box. We'll be happy to answer those. So just briefly here, if you're trying to get to resilience, when we're talking about ransomware attacks should be a given. You definitely should be expecting that they're going to happen at some point in the future here. And your ability to respond and create a resilience strategy really depends on a couple of factors. You got to plan for that attack now. You got to really, that specific attack, ransomware attack, not just an ability to recover, but actually a ransomware attack itself. You've got to determine what those gaps look like in your recovery strategy. You've got to make sure that you've got the right backup and recovery technology in place in order to make sure you can recover in those scenarios. And then when it makes sense, leverage a partner. They can be a great use and a big help to you as well. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton over to you, John. And then when you guys are done, like I said, throw it back to me. We'll see if we have any questions in the Q&A box.
Sure. This slide right here is just showing you basically the ability to recover with a simple kind of easy button, right? We all see the easy button commercials, right? So that's kind of what we want. We don't want a disaster recovery solution that's very complex, right? I don't want to have like tons of people involved, or I have to call people in from vacations possible if there's a real disaster. I don't want to have a ring binder of 50 pages of explaining how to do manual steps through things where anybody can make mistakes. That's the old school way of doing things, right? So Zerto kind of gives you that easy button. It's just you literally to fail over your entire application, an entire site, or an individual VM. It's just like a four push mouse click operation, right? You click a failover, you select the applications that you want to fail over or individual VMs. You verify those checkpoints, so the ability to fail back in 5 to 10 second increments, anywhere from an hour to 30 days, and you push start failover. Everything that happens after that has been pre-orchestrated within the groups that you've created. So when you set up your virtual protection groups, you're setting up boot orders of what orders the VMs come online. You're telling your virtual machines how you want them to re-IP themselves and reset their DNS settings when they fail over on the other side. And maybe you're running some scripts that you've created, like some PowerShell scripts against them after they fail over. All of that's been predetermined in your virtual protection group, which is like your run book basically for your disaster recovery failover. And you just press start failover. And you can do the same with a test as well. So you don't have to do a full-blown failover. You can test your entire application and bring it up at the DR site without affecting anything that's happening in production or your replication. This is just kind of like a high level of kind of what Zerto's IT resilience software platform is, right? So the biggest thing that we are is that we're a software-only approach, right? We're software-defined data center is kind of the new buzzword, right? You don't want to have anything that's relying on any kind of piece of hardware that you bought or relying on even the hypervisor, whether it be Hyper-V or VMware that you bought. You don't want to have any kind of vendor lock-in if possible, right? Any tools that you buy nowadays, you're always trying to buy tools that will work anywhere and with any of the other tools that you have, right? So that's like our biggest foundation, is that we're a software-defined data center approach, and that we're also continuous data protection, right? We're converging the functions of disaster recovery, operational recovery, recovering stuff locally, doing dev test, QA testing, patch testing, long-term retention. We can keep things past 30 days as well. And then also the ability to have a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud approach, being able to easily migrate between any different clouds, right? So the key points, like I said, it's 100% software defined, hypervisor agnostic, right? So we don't care if it's VMware or Hyper-V, and we're fully VM aware. So we tie right into your vCenter, your System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and we see everything in there, all of your virtual machines. There are no agents that you have to install in any of your virtual machines or VMware snapshots. So these are big selling points, right? I mean, VMware snapshots are painful. They affect production. They don't always delete themselves. Agents are painful because they affect production, and you have to maintain them, right? Usually you have to have some kind of console that can maintain all the agents. The installation takes minutes, and it doesn't require any reboots of any of your environment. So it's just standing up a Windows VM in your environment and pushing out a couple of virtual replication appliances in your own environment. No reboot of your hypervisors, no reboot of any of your production VMs. It's something that your VMware admin could do in the middle of the day, and nobody would even know that Zerto is installed on your side and ready to replicate. It's also hardware agnostic, so we could care less of what your underlying hardware is, right? You could have, NetApp underneath, but you could also have EMC. You could have a hyper-converged appliance. You could have vSAN, for instance, right? We don't care about the storage. We just see storage as, a data store in vCenter. We don't care what the underlying hardware is. So this is beautiful as well, right? There's no reliance on your storage-based replication, or your storage might not even have any storage-based replication, and this could add it for you, right? And then it's journal-based, right? So the ability to roll back to seconds rather than minutes, right? So typically you're always, with a typical backup solution, you may be failing back to a 4-hour window, maybe a 24-hour window, losing quite a bit of data. This is a push button and failing back to 5 seconds ago, right? And then the last piece is the ability to test. It has built-in testing, right? So at any point, you could push a test button and bring up an identical copy of your production workload in Offsite's data center. And you could basically log into Windows, log into your Linux VMs, make sure your application is up and running and test it as it's been re-IP'd possibly in the new data center. Make sure it looks good. If it looks good, you push a button to basically clean up that test and delete those VMs, and it'll dump you a nice PDF report that you can give to your boss and say, here, I did a DR test today, or for any kind of compliance needs. That's all I got for that one. I think that's off to you, Nick. Or is that Travis?
I'll take that. Yep. So thanks, John. So really, with OffsiteDataSync, we are that trusted partner. We are the experienced partner that has the expertise, kind of like I've talked about, the specialist that's performed hundreds of knee surgeries. So we have the experience, we have the knowledge base to help you with your company and IT resilience needs. Really, the biggest thing that kind of aligns with Zerto is we are flexible, we're scalable. We want to make it as seamless and easy as possible. We've talked about testing, we've talked about having ease of recoverability, and we can help you with that. So that's where, just kind of in a brief summary, as a trusted partner, instead of you managing, maintaining a secondary infrastructure, or maybe even hiring the resources, or training a staff to help and work through disasters or tests, or developing DR plans and strategies, that's where you can leverage us and our experience and our expertise and our knowledge and our history, and really we can work with you through that and help you. And that really is not limited to the size of your organization or where you're located or your data is. We have global data center presence, so we're able to meet just about any and all compliance, whether it's some sort of government, or whether it's even US-based compliance with HIPAA or ITAR, things like that. And we're always on the cutting edge. You can see we're a J2 global business. And so we have a lot of resources at our disposal, and we're able to get you where you need to be, so that in the event of a disaster, you can be up and running as quickly as possible and get back to the business that you're in.
So it looks like we've got about 2 minutes at the top of the hour. There are no questions in the Q&A box. And so we're going to just let class out early a little bit there. And so John, Travis, thanks so much, guys, for a great conversation. I really appreciate it. This was really educational today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, John.
Yep, and everyone in the audience, thank you for your attendance today. We hope this was informative for you. We believe that it was. And with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude today's webcast, and we'll catch you all in the next one.